Good morning and welcome to the second day of the Data Foundation's 2022 Symposium, co-hosted with George Washington University's Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration. I'm Dean Ritz. I'm a Senior Advisor to the CEO at Workiva and Chair of the Board of Directors of the Data Foundation. First, I want to thank my colleague Kathy Newcomer for her hosting of the first day's session of this symposium. Those of you who were there, I hope you had a good session and welcome back. Our symposium this year spotlights strategies to increase the use of data and evidence for decision-making in a better informed society. This, the second day of the symposium, focuses on innovation. In what areas have government agencies and other organizations expanded their capacity for building and using evidence, and how did they do it? What new tools and methods of planning and implementation have paid off? Well, today we will hear why the research-practice partnership is an effective model for evidence-based change, how longitudinal data systems can improve outcomes in K-12 education, and the importance of data linkages for improving social benefit programs at the state level. Today's topics will cover everything from building successful evidence teams to using COVID-19 equity data to fill gaps in state health agencies, to innovative data collaborations between social services departments and tax offices. We hope you enjoy this thorough look into how evidence capacity is being built and used across the country for the benefit of citizens everywhere. Well, thank you to everyone who is joining us for this event as a participant, a speaker, or as a moderator. So thanks again for your excellent work yesterday, Kathy. Our next presentation is titled Statewide Longitudinal Data Systems and Predictive Analytics, Understanding, Measuring, and Predicting K-12 Outcomes. So makes sense as a follow-on to our first presentation. We're trying to understand causal relationships of observations and the outcomes that we're after. I'm going to introduce Nancy Sharkey, who's the Senior Program Officer, Statewide Longitudinal Data Systems Grant Program, National Center for Education Statistics. And I'll let Nancy introduce their colleagues.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here with you all to talk about statewide longitudinal data systems and what people are doing with them in the field. So I'll introduce folks pretty quickly, but I think they can also introduce themselves if they want to talk more about who they are in relationship to their work. But we have Robin Clausen from the Montana Office of Public Instruction, Chris Stoddard from Montana State University, Matthew Uretsky from the Maryland Longitudinal Data System Center, and Angela Hennenberger from the Maryland Longitudinal Data System Center. And again, our goal is to speak largely about SLDS systems at large, but then also what folks are using or how folks are using them in the field to inform policy and practice. So I think I've already covered this slide. Our agenda is obviously to give a program overview of the SLDS program itself, and then also perspectives on how the systems are being used from Montana and Maryland. I think we can go to the next slide. And then if we could go to the next slide, please. All right, so I just want to give a really quick overview of the SLDS program. If you're looking for more information about the SLDS program, there's a slide at the end that'll give you some links to it. But the SLDS program itself was authorized in 2002 by the Education Sciences Reform Act and the Educational Technical Assistance Act. The nice thing about these grants is they are cooperative agreements, which enables a little bit more iterative relationships between the states and the federal government to make sure that the grants are actually meeting the goals of the state while also filling the requirements of the grant program itself. The technical assistance is also a pretty unique feature of the SLDS program, and we can provide technical assistance to all states and territories, or most states and territories, regardless of grantee status, which also enables us to create a more uniform support system for the field and not just for the states who receive grants. These grants are administered by the Institute of Education Sciences at the U.S. Department of Education, and within IES, the National Center for Education Statistics works most heavily on these grants. Next slide, please. This is just a picture of NCS so that you could see that the SLDS program sits within the Administrative Data Division. And this basically helps us have a really good sense of what states are doing. Part of the goal of the SLDS program initially in the 2002 legislation was to support states' efforts to do state and federal reporting. And the Administrative Data Division is where the data for EdFacts and iPads and a lot of other state collections go. So it makes sense that we are located in that Administrative Data Division within NCES. Next slide, please. So to date, 49 states plus American Samoa, CNMI, DC, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands have received grants totaling just over $800 million in 7 rounds. And you can see how these rounds broke out. In case you're wondering who has not yet received a grant, it's New Mexico, but they still do have an SLDS program, and we're supporting them with technical assistance. Can we go to the next slide? So this is the quick evolution of the program. Our first grants in 2006 and 2007 were primarily to help states take their various administrative data systems and pull them into an SLDS with K-12 data. In 2009, we expanded to say, let's add more data, or let's link additional sectors. So states were asked to link either pre-K or post-secondary or workforce, or to create a student-teacher data link. 2009 ARA, we had more money. We said, this is it. We want you to build the whole thing. So states were expected to build everything to connect to K-12, including, again, those sectors, pre-K, post-sec, workforce, and the student-teacher data link. In 2012, we said, you know what, that was a little too much. And we had less money. So we said, we went back and said, we want you to include one sector, and it needed to include pre-K or post-secondary or workforce, and be able to link that back to K-12. In 2015, we turned a corner a little bit. We said, we've been giving these grants for a few years now. There are a lot of monies out there. Let's start focusing more heavily on what states could do with the data instead of just collecting and organizing and storing the data. So we created priorities that were focused on data use, and they're listed here. Now, it's important to remember that even if a state asked for data use, they could put some money into infrastructure or data collection and storage if the use case that they were imagining needed data that weren't already included in or linked to their system. But it's, again, important that they were responsible for that, the use case, and not just the data linking. In 2019, we took a step back and we said there's been a lot of developments in the field with regard to technology and data storage systems. And just like, you know, the kitchen that you put in your house in 1980 was probably a little dated by 2019. The systems that states had been building for almost 15 years at this point were a bit out of date. So we said, okay, let's go back. You could use the funds to improve your infrastructure. And a lot of states opted for that priority. States could also take an education choice priority or focus on equity. And then in addition to that, we granted 16 states additional funds to work on a school level poverty measure that the department was interested in and that we're currently supporting. And next slide, please. So the key information about the grants is they tend to be 4 years. States do ask for no-cost extensions, and usually we can grant them. For the current grant round, the start was March 1st of 2020. The official project end date is February 28th, 2024. But again, I think because of COVID, a lot of states are going to need a little extra time. And we have those 3 priority areas. And here you can see, as I said, most states chose the infrastructure priority because they wanted to update their IT support systems for the SLDS projects. Next slide, please. All right. So as I said, one of the awesome things about the SLDS program is we are able to provide technical assistance. So if we could go to the next slide. So the state support team provides free technical assistance to the states and territories, regardless of whether or not they have an active SLDS grant, which is terrific because it enables us to get kind of scale things up, even if states don't have active grants, because they're able to still get support and learn from their peers. Each state and territory has an assigned state support team point of contact who's tasked with being their primary go-to person if the state needs any technical assistance. And there's a link here to describe the state point of contact one pager. Next. So the state support team is a group of data systems experts, and they're tasked really with helping states develop, manage, use, and sustain SLDSs. Most members of the state support team came from state education agencies, so they have a really on-the-ground understanding of what it takes to build and use these systems in the states, but also the constraints that are associated with building and using the systems. Some of the common topics that they discuss include things like data governance, stakeholder engagement, project management, sustainability, data use, transparency, data linking, vendor management, design, planning, and developing research agendas. As you can see, these are not the technical topics, all of them that we would expect to be associated with an IT project, but they're much more about the processes that need to be established and developed and sustained in order for one of these big IT projects to be successful. So they provide support in all of the sectors, from K-12 and early childhood up to workforce and including social service data. Again, they come with on-the-ground experience developing and implementing the system. So they're pretty good at what they do. At least we think so. There are a few types of technical assistance opportunities available to state. States can just call and ask for help, and we can set up ongoing calls and site visits with state support team members. And in those visits, we would look at their project plans and any other documentation, for example, like a data governance strategy or an organization chart or something. But anything that states might ask for help with if they're trying to figure out how to implement the system. We provide resources, training, and examples. A lot of these examples come from other states because one of the great things about working with all states is we have some insight into what other states are doing. We can also connect states with their peers, and I think fundamentally this is probably the greatest value add we have, is being able to send one state to another state that has already experienced the challenge and can provide insight on how to overcome it. And then we also use the TA assistance to help determine state needs, both for technical assistance, but also thinking about future grant rounds or contact with other program offices within the department to see how we can help states across the board. Another strategy we have for technical assistance is to bring states together more directly. So we have a best practice conference where all states and territories are invited to participate and share their lessons learned and their challenges. And we pay for non-grantees to attend that conference. Grantees are expected to use grant funds to pay their own way. We also have a resource sharing repository where we put all of our TA resources, and states can also put resources to help each other. We create publications based on our technical assistance activities and sometimes in advance of technical assistance activities. We have topical working groups where we bring states together to address specific problems. Examples are we've done topical working groups on including foster care in systems, or talking about how states were including military connected families in their data systems. We host webinars where states come and share their experiences with each other. Communities of practice, where we have a broader basic state sharing of thinking about how to address specific problems. Personnel exchange network, where we can afford to send states to visit other states to be in their environment with them and see how things are going. I personally experienced this when I worked on an SLDS project for DC, and we went to Kansas to observe their day of data governance activities. And I think that day informed my understanding of data governance much more deeply than just reading the documentation that Kansas could have shared with us. Kansas also pre-briefed the day and debriefed the day to A, let us know what we were going to be looking at, and then B, to answer any questions about what we saw and see if we could then take these processes back home to DC to implement. So I think the Penn visits are extraordinarily helpful. And then finally, we have a listserv where states can talk to each other, ask questions. Does anybody have this indicator and how are you doing it? For example, would be a question that states pitch to each other on the listserv. We have a bunch of best practice resources, including issue briefs, guides, state and territory spotlights, and webinar summaries. So all of the work that we're doing is being documented so that states can access it, whether or not they were able to participate in a meeting in person. And then we have communities of practice where they are organized around our framework, which covers 7 essential components of an effective SLDS, including things like data governance, data use, and various other topics that we think are critically important. This enables states to talk to each other around those critical components in a facilitated conversation with the state support team. Finally, I keep saying finally, but we also have webinars for states to demonstrate what they've done, share their best practices, and also share knowledge in a timely fashion. So we plan these webinars as topics come up, which enables us to really respond to what states are doing in the field and what the state needs are. All of our webinars are recorded, again, so folks who couldn't attend in person can still benefit from the knowledge shared. And many of them have webinar summaries available in our TA platform. And webinars are open to staff from all state agencies because we recognize that while the SEA is the grantee in these projects, they're working with folks from labor and HHS and other agencies within the state. So pretty much anyone who works at state agency can get into a webinar and then access the resources. We have partnerships with other TA providers, which also I think helps us to meet state needs in a broader sense. So we work closely with the Common Education Data Standards team, PTAC, which helps states with privacy and data security issues, the Center for the Integration of IDEA data, which is helping states work on reporting of early childhood IDEA data. And then we also work quite closely with EDFACS and the EDFACS data management team, because a lot of the issues that our states are encountering with EDFACS are also tied into building SLDS programs and data governance of SLDS programs. So we work quite closely with them. And that I think I'm running out of time, but I'm going to give a quick intro to the Common Education Data Standards because it's tied quite closely to the SLDS program, but it's a national collaborative effort that has voluntary common data standards. So we basically brought people together from across the country and said, basically, what data elements do you think you need to have in a P20W? And those teams of people came up with the shared understanding and created data elements. So there is a SEDS data warehouse, we have SEDS data elements, and then there's a SEDS IDS. And then if you're more interested in CDS, and I hope you are, there's a link in the slide so you can access all of our information there. And then in addition to the CDS and data warehouse itself, we have some tools that I think you'd find really interesting. One of them is Align, which enables states to align their data dictionaries to the CDS elements to see, okay, if everyone thinks we should have these things, do we? And how closely are they aligned? Does this word mean what we think it means, or does the field think it means something else? For example, there's a connection tool, which enables you to see other states' alignment maps, and then also see how you are all aligned. It also enables you to build, for example, a research question with your data elements in it. So if you wanted to say, for example, or another state puts in there, we're able to look at the percentage of kids who were taught by highly qualified teachers. the connection would have all of the elements that that state would use to show that they can connect, figure out what percentage of kids are taught by highly qualified teachers. And then if you have also aligned your state assistant to CDS, you could see if you could answer that question and what elements you would be using to answer that question. So we think this is a pretty helpful way to help states answer questions, but also to help researchers see how states could answer questions and what questions states can answer. So if you're trying to figure out which state can support a research question, the Connect tool might be a place to start. We also have an open source community, which is all about the CDS user community coming up with questions that they would like to resolve or issues that they're experiencing, but then also helping to generate the solutions to the problems that they're experiencing as a collective. Ultimately, we would like CDS to be largely governed by its users, and the open source community is how we hope to accomplish that goal. If you want to learn more about CDS, we have open source community meetings every month. And this is, as I've said, all the changes to CDS start in the open source community. So if you have any questions about it or suggestions for improvement, feel free to attend a meeting. And then I think hopefully this is pretty clear, but the collaboration with the Partner Support Center and data management, this is one of getting back to collaboration. This is all about making sure that all of our teams are aware of what the Department of Education is planning, and so that we can help states reach those goals. And also so that EdVacs has a greater understanding of the state support team scope, TA, so that again we can make sure that the partner support can suggest the state support team if it sounds like a bigger question than simply an EdVacs question. And then we just want to make sure that all of the federal teams have a better understanding of the current state of SEA's human, organizational, and technical capacity. And this again is just to help make sure that the TA that all of us are providing are more useful to states, and that we're providing technical assistance that's cohesive, coherent, and most importantly, not discordant. We would hate for states to get different recommendations for improvement depending on who you talk to. And again, this will make sure that states get more holistic TA, and that they're better prepared for future improvements that the department is making in terms of data collections. And those are the links. If you have any questions, just feel free to reach out.
We do have some questions that are coming in, but we'll save those for the end. Hopefully I'll have a couple of minutes. If we don't get your questions, we will provide them to the speakers, and then find some way to get the answers to them.
Yeah, I'm always here.
So let's move on to the state perspective. I'll let you go to Montana.
Hello, my name is Robin Clausen. I'm from the Montana Office of Public Instruction, and I work on the statewide longitudinal data system here in Montana. And I am the stakeholder liaison. I network with various stakeholders and also sponsor research activities. And I'm also a data analyst for the Montana Office of Public Instruction. Next slide, please. So in our statewide longitudinal data system, we have a web portal called GEMS, and it stands for Growth and Enhancement of Montana Students. And essentially, GEMS provides about 50 different reports and dashboards that report on data back to schools, from anywhere from school finance to enrollment to dropout graduation to achievement, et cetera, et cetera. And this is online, ready to access data that people can, especially school districts and school users, can access the data. What I'm here to talk about today is the early warning system, which is which consists of 3 of those different reports that I mentioned a little bit earlier. The goal of the early warning system is to get students back to school and to stay in school, hence the slide. And that's what the guiding rubric that I'd like you to think about for the rest of the presentation is that we really focus in on the student and providing actionable data for school districts to be able to ameliorate dropout and sponsor graduation. Next slide, please. So our reports consist of three different reports: a school level report, a student summary report, and a student detail report. Now, all this is guided by a logistic regression model that assigns students with a dropout probability of greater than 15% as at risk, and as students with a greater than 40% dropout probability is as extreme at risk. Next slide, please. So this is our a screenshot of some of our fake data that we have in the system for demonstration purposes only. This is a school that we have added to. It's called the Early Warning Systems Demonstration School. And it kind of gives you a highlight of what school districts are able to use on the district level. Basically, it's broke down into 4 different areas: grades, behavior, mobility, and attendance. Mobility and attendance are farther down on this page, and it's broke out by grade level, and it shows trends, school-wide trends of data points for the whole cohort of students that have been uploaded into the EWS system. Now, approximately 1/5 of the state participate in the EWS system, and about most schools and about half of their students, those focusing specifically on graduation and dropout factors, to the early warning system and to contribute to the logistic regression model. Next slide, please. This slide is a description of a student level report. Now, there's 2 things that are important. Off to the left is various contextual data about the student, and off to the right, you'll see those arrows. A straight up red arrow means that graduation probability has changed over time, and you're really able to track over the last 12 times how a student's graduation probability has changed. And you're also able to look at warning factors, which is the red exclamation points. And it will note areas in which different factors may be over 1.25 to trigger exclamation point. And you'll be able to look below at the different factors and track trends over time within that individual student. Next slide, please. So basically, we're conducting a research study sponsored by the National Center for Educational Research, which is an arm of the Institute of Educational Sciences. The research study is geared toward using the SLDS for research and sponsoring SLDS data so that researchers can actively use that data in order to sponsor program goals of the SLDS. So our research question 1 focuses on graduation. Basically, we look for, in this study, instead of looking for those students that are assigned as dropouts and who do drop out, we instead looked at those students that are actual dropouts, but who were predicted to be graduates in order to better refine the system. So this is essentially the scope of research 1, and in this partial confusion matrix, we provide, we focus on the false positives. Next slide, please. We also look at implementation of the early warning system. Now, there are approximately 140 schools that have added data at least once to the early warning system. About a third of those districts, those schools have only participated one time in the system. The others tend to participate and upload data greater than 10 times. So that's just the basic trend. My colleague Chris Stoddard, who is after me, will go into detail about these trends. Basically, we released a survey, and we're hoping to gauge by the survey. It's still up, and we're hoping to gauge by our survey implementation factors. And along with quantitative data that we've collected behind the scenes, we'll create an implementation index on a scale of 1 to 4. And this next year, we'll provide compensation to schools, to 15 different schools or school districts, trying to get 3 people per school district to participate in an interview. Next slide, please. Our research question 3 focuses on different factors that help student performance, including graduation, college attendance, and high school attendance. And we'll also look at various subgroups, and we'll also look at various students that have been exposed to the EWS, for example, back to 3rd grade on through high school. What are their data points, and what are some trends emerging from the long-term exposure to the EWS? Next slide, please. So basically, we're here to filter the data from the Montana, from GEMS, from the Montana Statewide Longitudinal Data System, hand it off to MSU, work together and create actionable items that we can present to national and state audiences, including to our own state superintendent to guide programmatic decisions about the early warning system. Next slide, please. So we have delivered data to MSU. We are now in round 2 or round 3 of delivering data. MSU has completed year 1 of the NCR study, and they're starting work on year 2 with the change of the fiscal year. And with that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Chris Stoddard from Montana State University, and she'll go into a little bit about the results.
Thanks, Robin. Let's see.
Dr. Stoddard, if I could interrupt for just a second, this is your moderator. Because I know we have another part of your third part of your presentation, which will follow. So I just want to make you aware of the time. Well, we were hoping to do questions starting at 10 minutes after the hour, but we'll try to compress that. So if you want to take 8 minutes, so you can leave your last colleagues with some time as well, that would be great.
You bet. And I can probably go even quicker if needed.
Great. There you go.
All right. So as Robin, so my name is Chris Stoddard. I'm not sure if my video is showing up yet, but I think I said yes. Okay. So I'm a professor in the economics department at Montana State University, and myself and Andrew Hill, another professor in the department, have been digging into the data here. And one of the first things that we've found, which has been really interesting, is that how, even though, as Robin mentioned, about 20% of schools have been using the early warning system, their use of it varies a lot. And so you can see here over the 2015 to 2020 period, some schools are, pulling data reports, 14 times, others, barely at all. And interestingly, it also appears that schools are not looking at all of their students, but have already kind of decided, here are the students that we want to focus on, and are pulling about half of the students at a time to look at what's going on. Next slide, please. So as Robin mentioned, one of the things that we're interested in is looking at, how well is this early warning system doing at prediction? So are we getting, kind of good numbers out of that, or does the model need to be tweaked? So we've pulled data on students who we've seen long enough to be able to tell whether or not they have graduated. And so on the left there, we're looking at these different rows, students who were scored at some point over the course of being monitored, who were ever had a score that they were at extreme risk of dropping out. We looked at students who had scores of being at risk of dropping out, but were never flagged as at extreme risk. And then there are the students, these ones that we're thinking about as kind of looking at these false positives. So students who were never flagged as at risk, how often did they graduate? So what we find is that the model's doing a pretty good job of flagging students who are never at risk. 92% of them are in fact actually graduating. So there are only 7 to 8% of these students who aren't flagged as at being at risk who are dropping out, which is, I think, a pretty good success for the model in terms of empirically trying to identify those students. We also see that of students who were scored as at extreme risk, and if you remember, the prediction there was, if they had a prediction above 40%, what percentage of them are actually graduating? About 40% of them are actually graduating. Almost 60% of them are in fact dropping out, where those students who had kind of these lower risk levels have a higher probability of graduating. So looks like the early warning system is doing a pretty good job here. So next slide, please. Oh, I think that's all those. Oh, there we go. I was going to say, oh, I guess we're done. So the preliminary results that we've looked at so far show that that early warning system is really strongly correlated with actual graduation experiences, that very few students that are never flagged by the system as at risk are dropping out. We are finding that students without an EWS score have higher dropout rates than students in the EWS system as well. So I didn't show you those slides. That's the stage of the analysis that we're looking at. So now we're looking at these schools that are not participating at all in the EWS system. So their students were never scored. And at least in this very preliminary kind of descriptive look that we've done so far, those students do seem to be performing worse in terms of dropouts than students who their schools have been pulling them in the EWS system. But of course, as we're trying to think about kind of causal effects here, at this stage of the analysis, we don't want to put too much stock in that, because the non-participating schools, of course, might be different than the participating schools. So, maybe those non-participants aren't using the early warning system because they have fewer resources, they have less administrative capacity. Maybe they would have had higher dropout rates regardless of EWS use. So that's the stage of the analysis that we're moving into now, looking at how dropout rates are changing for these EWS adopting schools and the non-adopting schools in order to tease out that possibility. And we'll supplement that with what Robin has talked about, by getting additional data from the schools on how they're actually using the early warning system, combined with what the data is telling us about how they're using the early warning system. All right, so I think next slide, and we can pass it off to Maryland. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Oops. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here. My name is Matthew Uretsky. I'm an associate professor now at Portland State University. And I'm here to talk to you about persisting students, which is a unique group of high school non-graduates that we identified using the statewide longitudinal data system in Maryland. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you a super quick overview of the MLDS, which is Maryland's longitudinal data system. an introduction and a background on persisters, kind of who they are and how we ended up focusing on them, how we identify them, some of the rates of persisters, and a brief summary of the outcomes for persisters, and then some of the implications for research. Next slide, please. So the MLDS Center is an independent state agency. It develops and maintains a data system for student and workforce data from public education and the state's workforce. It was established in state law in 2010, and it began operations around 2013, 2014. We got our first data loads in 2014, and in 2015, we started posting our first public dashboards and research reports. Next slide. We have a pretty broad array of data partners at this point. We started out with K-12 and higher education and the workforce, labor, but now we have occupational licensing coming, child welfare, also recently added juvenile delinquency records, and it just keeps growing, and it's getting more rich and gives us a lot more ability to trace students and young people through their life trajectories, understanding kind of the multimodal influences on their life. Next slide. So to give you a sense of why we got to persisters, most studies, as we know, kind of have this dichotomy between dropout and graduate. And it's really a little too simplistic to describe the true path of students through the K-12 system. There's a lot of really great work with early warning indicators, which you've heard about, and also typologies, which focus on like the push outs and the pull outs and kind of understanding types of dropout. But what we notice is there's something missing from the conversation. And we were noticing in the data, basically, that the dropout and the graduation rate don't add up to 100%. And there's these students who drop out, but who don't drop out. They're still enrolled on their expected graduation date, but they're also not graduating on time. And we're calling those students persisters. Next slide. So we have some useful definitions really quick. So you know about on-time graduates, you know about who are students who graduate 4 years after entering the high school as a first-time freshman. You know who dropouts, students who formally drop from school without enrolling in another degree-seeking institution. And then we have this third group, which we're calling persisters, which are students who don't earn a regular diploma in 4 years, but are still enrolled on their expected graduation date. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to give you a brief summary of how we're identifying persisters in Maryland. Next slide. So we start by establishing the cohort. So first we have a year zero. We're looking for 8th grade enrollment and then establishing a 9th grade enrollment. We want to be really sure that we're looking at students in their first 9th grade year, because for this group, timing is really the critical indicator of whether they're a persistent or not. So then at year 4, we go and we establish their exit status, which means they've either dropped out, transferred out, graduated, or they're still enrolled in school. Next slide, please. So what you see here is kind of like a flow or a systems diagram looking at students as they move through their 4 years of high school. So they start off asking at their 4th year of high school. So did they earn a regular diploma 4 years after entering the 9th grade? If yes, they're an on-time graduate. If no, are they a persister or are they a dropout? We're asking, are they still enrolled in their expected graduation date? Next slide, or click, 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 click. Okay, and then you can see kind of the cycle repeats over the 4th year or over the 5th year, asking, did they re-enroll? If not, they eventually dropped out. If they did, yes, they're a 5th year persister. And you can say, click again, please. You can see it just continues on through the 6th year, as long as they still maintain eligibility for continuing through high school, like continuing enrollment in high school. Next slide, please. Next slide. So this is a Sankey diagram. We pulled it from the engineering research where they use this to trace the flow of steam through ships actually originally. And we're looking here through what happened to students over time in the 4th through 6th year of the non-graduates, so the people who did not earn a diploma in 4 years. So importantly, we did not include the early dropouts in this, so the people who are dropping out in year 1 through 3, and that's because they don't meaningfully re-engage in school, at least in the state of Maryland. There's a very small percentage are re-engaging in year 5 or ever graduating at all, although some do go on to earn a GED. Click, please. So you see here about 80% of the people who make it to their fourth year are persisters. Click. And about 20% are dropouts. Click. And you can see that a small portion of the dropouts are re-enrolling for summer or year 5. Actually, the dropouts really don't re-enroll for summer. They tend to come back at year 5 if they come back at all. Click. But most of them are moving directly into having no high school credential at all. Click. And some of the persisters are moving into having no high school credential at all. Click. But about 97% of persisters enroll in either summer or year 5. Click again, and again. So about 14% of dropouts re-enroll overall, but about 97% of persisters are re-enrolling. Click. Click. So you see some of the year 4 dropouts are moving on to getting a GED. Click again. And also a very small percentage of persisters are going directly into getting a GED. Click again. And then a small portion of the people who re-enroll in year 5 are going on to get a GED. But this is really important because a lot of times in the research, there's either graduate or not. So you don't actually know what are the competing forces pulling people in and out of school. Like, are they actually GED earners or not? We really didn't know how many of the students were leaving school to get a GED instead of continuing. And what we saw is it's not a major draw away. Click. Click again. And click again. So what we see here is, importantly, about half, a little bit less than half of persisters go on to graduate in their 5th year without any intentional intervention. Click again. But importantly, about 81% of dropouts, students who dropped out before the end of year 4 are not having any high school credential by the end of the 5th year. So you're seeing a huge disparity in outcomes. So one of the first questions is, are these groups meaningfully different? And at least behaviorally, we're finding they are pretty meaningfully different. Click again. Click again. So what you see here is overall about 60% of the population of non-graduates earns no high school credential by the end of year 5. Click again. And about 2/3 overall have no participation in college or the workforce by the end of year 6. Click again. Click again. What you see here, which is kind of interesting, is that GED earners and year 5 graduates have relatively similar experiences in college and the workforce and the amount of people who are not participating. But what you see is that the people with no high school credential, click again, about 75% of them have no participation in school. So getting them some sort of completion is super important. And what we believe is that the persisters are a low-hanging fruit. They're a group of young people that are not graduating in time, but they are still meaningfully engaged despite all of the push and pull factors that are incurred that are making it harder for them to complete school. Click again. So here, what we see is, click again, sorry, some of this is not showing up on the slide. So the on-time graduates, the late graduates, and the GED earners. So the 80% is on-time graduates, the 33%, okay, I'm gonna push through this. So what we see overall is about the GED earners and on-time and late graduates have very similar rates of attending college and college graduation, click again, and also working in year 10 or 11. In addition, we see that on-time graduates actually have very similar rates compared to all 3 groups, but the rates of graduation of working is not quite the most important thing. Really, what we're interested in wages. So click again. And what we see here, if you click again, is that on-time graduates and on-time graduates and GED earners start at a very similar medium wage right after their expected graduation date, if you click again. But the on-time graduates have a much steeper slope. So their rates of wages are going up at a much faster rate. But again, what you see here is that the late graduates seem to be overtaking the GED earners over time. So they seem to have a steeper slope. So future research, we're hoping to figure out whether that slope is maintained and whether there's the relative value of late graduation versus GED matters. So if you're trying to give people kind of options or suggestions about where to go, given that you haven't graduated high school on time, you might have a better sense of it. Click again. Click again. So overall, most important thing, persisting students, they consistently outnumber dropouts 4-to-1 in year 4. If you include early dropouts, it's much higher. They have a much higher re-enrollment rate in year 5, more than 7-to-1, and a much higher graduation rate in year 5, more than 12-to-1. And all these numbers are much higher if you include the early graduates. Nearly all persisters re-enroll, but more than half of them have no high school credential by the end of year 5, meaning there's a lot of opportunity in this group. And we also have a lot to learn about GED earners and late grads. Next slide. So, So the most important implication I'd like you to walk away with is that we should be considering persisters alongside dropout to provide a more informative analysis of high school graduation. We really can't a lot of the research that we see, the historical research on dropouts, we may be seeing different outcomes if we include persisters. So for example, a lot of the false positives that we see in the dropout or false positives we see in the early warning indicator research, we may be able to tease that out if we included persisters as a third group in there, because a lot of the false positives may actually be persisters rather than dropouts or on-time graduates. Better identification and continued study of this can help increase graduation rates for both persisters and dropouts, and also promote a cascade of positive life outcomes. And encouraging late graduating and GED earning may be viable alternatives to each other. Next slide. I think we are short on time, so I'm going to leave it there and just say thank you very much. And we have reports and publications that we're happy to share to give you more information on this stuff.
Great, thank you very much, Matthew. So the questions fall into 2 categories. So one category is just really the relationship between the Longitudinal Data Systems grant program and the Montana and Maryland. And then the other groups of questions are around your specific programs in those states. So let me start with the one about the relationship. If each of you, Dr. Stoddard, Dr. Uretsky, if you could talk about very briefly how the grant program facilitated your success in your individual states' research, so people understand the relationship between the grant program and what it actually achieved on the ground.
Sure. So this is Chris Stoddard from Montana, and so I would say, it's been integral in this particular research. So the Office of Public Instruction and Montana State have now partnered on several different research projects under the grant program over a number of years. So this is only one of them. And as you've seen from Robin, that there's a really close relationship that we have with Robin and Office of Public Instruction, asking them lots of data questions, having access to the data. And also, it's an ongoing, feedback relationship. So as we've gotten into the data, for example, looking at how schools are actually using the early warning system, the Office of Public Instruction is able to take that information to then go out to the state and talk to folks on the ground and say, hey, here's what we're seeing in the data, and can you tell us more about, how are you deciding which 50% of students to pull, and why aren't you, pulling that for everybody or whatever. So I would say it's been really helpful in enabling this kind of both data access and then also the ability to kind of get more contact with users of the data and figure out how they're using it, which then of course informs the research. So
very good, thank you. Dr. Uretsky, did you have any comments on how the program supported your work?
Yeah, I agree with Chris. It was really integral. I don't see any way that this line of work could have happened without a statewide longitudinal data system, and the statewide longitudinal data system would not be around without the grants. Being able to see these, seeing like making meaning out of missing data is it's a hard job, and it's hard to know that you're not just like chasing ghosts. And having the statewide data and the longitudinal data, being able to check multiple cohorts across the state and look at countywide differences, gave us the confidence to believe that we were seeing a true phenomenon and not just artifacts in the data. So I think this entire line of research would have been impossible without the grants.
Oh, very good. Well, let's move on to some questions about your specific experiences or your experiences in your specific state-specific programs. So some of these questions are around data management. And have the data standards that were presented earlier, are those being used by you? And did they help you integrate data from across different data systems? I guess the general question is, how did you address the challenge of data being in different systems when it came to finally aggregating to work with the data? It's open to anyone.
In Montana, we have mapped our GEMS website to CEDS since about 2015. And there's been progressive iterations of it, so we have to redo the mapping. Now, under the infrastructure grant, we are proposing a total recall of our statewide longitudinal data system. That won't impact the public website per se, but it'll impact everything in the background. And the basis of that is the CEDS framework. And we'll be making it ubiquitous across our systems at the Montana Office of Public Instruction.
Very good. Other commenters? Okay. So another question we had is equity data. If equity data was used as part of the modeling for the predictions in your state programs.
I mean, for us at least, we make this is Matthew Uretsky again from Portland State. It's part of all of our questions, right? We're always checking for disparities and differences in how different group outcomes. And for example, one really interesting finding that we have that I didn't get a chance to get into is the experience of Black students in among the non-graduates. So we find that if you just compare on-time graduates to everybody else, Black students are less likely to graduate on time. But if you look between dropouts and persisters, Black students are much more likely to be persisters than dropouts. So what we're seeing is even in both cases, you're finding money invested into places that is less likely to support Black students. So when you're looking at dropout programs, that group is actually more white than persisters, but there's no targeted programs because there's just historically no language for persisters. There's no grant programs, there's no special days, there's no special staff at schools or programming for them. And so we see these young people are in many ways probably benefiting from dropout programming, but there's no meaningfully targeted programming for persisters, which means that this group of Black students who are not graduating on time, but still engaged in school and trying, are really going unrecognized. Their efforts are going unrecognized, and they're not getting the support that they would need to convert their persistence into graduation.
Wow. And it's very interesting what you raise, right? If we don't measure, it doesn't exist. That's sort of how it's come about, or so it's so important to keep the open mind and look for the outlying data. Other questions we have here relate to, I guess one's a technical question, and it is cost of participation in the program, essentially. for the technical assistance component for supporting this cooperative agreement? Is there a price tag for such a thing? I think that might go back to you, Nancy.
Yeah, so do you mean, is it the total cost of TA or the cost of states of TA? Because the states receive the technical assistance for free, regardless of grantee status. So we've, as the Educational Technical Assistance Act, which I mentioned came up, was passed in 2002 alongside the education, as part of that 2002 suite of legislation, it mandated that the government would provide technical assistance to help states build these systems. So it's free to states.
Very good. A question that hasn't been asked by others, but I'll raise it. Have some of the solutions that you've been using for the different states are recommending based on open source software? How are these systems being built? Are they being built from proprietary systems, commercial products, custom development within a state, or open source software, or all over the map?
Yeah, all of the above, I think, is the answer. I mean, typically our application process is states propose what they think would make most sense for their environment. And then, again, meeting the basic requirements of the grant program, and also, filling the bucket or the priority area that they applied under. But if a state finds that an open source tool makes more sense, or they work with a vendor to buy customized, or some of them pick up software that other states have worked on, or vendors that have worked with other states whose environments are similar to theirs. It's really up to the states to determine how best to meet that cooperative agreement.
Okay, another question for you. I'll just keep going here. One of our attendees is asking about project management templates. If your program provides those to help the states or researchers get started, organize their programs for participation.
Yeah, I mean, we have technical assistance guides, including toolkits to help states do self-assessments of where they are, and then to plot out the next steps based on wherever they determine is the best place to start. And those toolkits include things like implementing data governance or building an early childhood integrated data system. CDS also has toolkits for figuring out how to do alignment maps and how to use the various tools in CDS. So I would just encourage folks to use the links that are included in the slide deck and look for specifically where it says resources, because that's where a lot of the toolkits can be found on our websites.
All right, very good. Good. Can we try to squeeze in one more question here? This is unfortunately, the questions that come in probably take their own seminars in order to answer. So the last question I wanted to raise is the one about teasing out, as I describe it, whether future educational and work outcomes vary by group as a result of finishing high school or by other factors. How do you address that it might not have anything to do with finishing high school, but rather by other factors? And I guess this goes back to the researchers from the States.
This is Matthew from Portland State. That's a project we're actively working on right now. We're looking at wage trajectories over time, specifically focused on students who are not completing high school. So on late graduates, non-graduates, and GED earners, and trying to understand kind of, the impacts of, traditional predictors over time, but also just kind of understanding whether there are differences. And the differences, when you look at the research, the existing research, it's pretty limited, actually. When you start to look at late graduates, there's almost no research out there. And the comparisons tend to be pretty small, or limited, or very old. So we're actively trying to tease out that exact question. So hopefully we'll have an answer for you in the next few months.
For your state. Yeah, very good. Well, I want to thank the panelists for their excellent preparation, for sharing their experiences with us.